would probably tell me to get to the point, so here's the point. My parents put me in the basement at 17 and kept me there until I was 24, and the whole time they had a name for me at parties. The disappointment. The one who didn't turn out. Meanwhile, my brother Micah got the finished bedroom upstairs, the car, the tuition, the toasts. I'm not writing this because I'm sad about it. I'm writing this because 6 weeks ago, my mother called me for the first time in 2 years, and I already knew why, and I'd already spent a long time getting ready for exactly that call. So buckle up, because I've been waiting to tell somebody this for a while. Let me back up so it makes sense, because the why matters more than the basement does. My brother Micah is 3 years older than me. Growing up, the story in our house was already written before I could talk. Micah was the one going places, and I was the one they'd have to keep an eye on. It wasn't nothing that started it either. I want to be fair, because I've thought about this more than any person should think about anything. When I was 15, my parents put a chunk of money into a thing Micah wanted to do, some business idea with a friend, and I told them it wouldn't work, and I said it in front of people at a family dinner and it didn't work and they lost the money. In my parents' heads, that got rewritten into me being the reason it fell apart. Like my saying it out loud jinxed it. Like Micah would have made it if his little brother hadn't been so negative. That's the origin of the whole thing. I was the kid who tore the family down instead of the kid who happened to be right. So by the time I was 17 and my dad, Anton, decided the house needed restructuring because money was tight, guess whose room became the guest room and whose stuff went to the basement? There was a real reason on paper. They took in my grandmother for a while. She needed a bedroom, fine. But she moved out after a year and I never moved back up. The basement just became where I lived. There was a bathroom down there, the old kind with the rust stain and the toilet that never came out. And somewhere in year 2 it became my job to keep the downstairs bathrooms clean because, and I'm quoting the family logic here, I was down there anyway and it wasn't like I was busy with anything important. Micah was at school. Micah was building his future. I was the one with time. I need you to understand I wasn't some rebel kid slamming doors. That's the part that still gets me. I was quiet. I did the chores. I kept my head down because every time I didn't, it became a whole thing about my attitude, about how hard I made everything, about how Micah never gave them this trouble. My mother, Christina, had this way of introducing me at family parties. And we had a lot of them, birthdays, the 4th, Christmas, where she'd sort of laugh and say, "Don't mind him, he's our project. He's still figuring it out." Everyone would chuckle. Micah, loudest. I was 20 years old, standing in my own kitchen being called a project by my mother while holding a paper plate. The specific thing that I never let go of, and I've turned this over so many times, happened at Micah's engagement party when I was 22. It was in the backyard, big thing. Christina had strung up lights, Anton was doing his host routine, and someone, one of Micah's fiance's relatives, asked what I did. Before I could answer, Micah put his arm around me in front of everybody and said, "Oh, this is the family's ongoing renovation project, still stripped to the studs?" And everyone laughed. And my dad raised his glass and said something like, "Maybe someday we'll get a permit." And the whole yard thought it was the funniest thing. I remember standing there with the string lights and the paper plate and deciding, not in some dramatic way, just quietly and completely, that I was done being the punchline and that one day the joke was going to cost them. I didn't cry. I didn't leave. I got another burger and I started thinking. Here's the part where people usually ask why I didn't just leave earlier. I did leave, at 24, but leaving at 17 wasn't a thing I could do. I had no money, no diploma yet, no way to sign a lease or do anything an adult does. What I could do was the long, boring version. I finished school. I got a job the day I turned 18 and I kept it. And I got a second one. I lived in that basement rent-free on purpose, and yeah, that's the ugly little truth of it. The basement they meant as a punishment I used. Every dollar I would have spent on rent I didn't spend. I let them think I was the loser who couldn't move out because being underestimated was the most useful thing I had going. When my mother told the relatives I still lived at home at 23, she thought she was embarrassing me. She was funding me. By the time I moved out at 24, I had more saved than Micah, who by then had the wedding, the lease on a place he couldn't really afford, and a lifestyle my parents kept quietly topping up. I started buying and fixing small things. I'll get into the specifics in later parts because it's the whole spine of how I ended up where I am. But the short version is I learned how property and private lending work, the boring paperwork side, the part nobody at those parties would have believed I could understand, because I was the renovation project, remember? Not the guy who'd actually learn renovation. Now here's where the house comes in, and this is the thing that's been sitting in my chest for years like a coal. About 3 years ago, my parents hit a rough patch. Anton's work dried up for a stretch, and they'd been living bigger than they should have for a long time. The parties, the constant help to Micah, all of it. Instead of downsizing, they did what people do, which is borrow against the house they already owed on. They couldn't get clean bank money for the amount they wanted, so they took a big private second loan, the hard kind, secured against the house, short-term, ugly interest, the sort of thing you sign when you're sure your situation is temporary and you'll refinance out of it before it matters. I know all this because my mother told half of it to relatives as a "we're helping Micah get on his feet" story, and Micah told the other half of it bragging. And the paperwork side I understood on my own because by then, understanding paperwork was literally what I did. That note, the private one, the one against the house, is coming due. And I know exactly who ended up holding it, and I've known for a while. And I've been very, very patient about it. 6 weeks ago, my mother called me. First time in 2 years. She did the whole warm thing. "How are you? We miss you. You know your father isn't as young as he was." And then she got to it, which was that things were tight and she wondered if I'd come around. And maybe I could help. Family helps family. She actually said family helps family to me, to the renovation project, to the guy who cleaned the rust-stained toilet for 4 years while they toasted my brother. And I said, "Of course, Mom. Let's talk. Let's all sit down. You, Dad, Micah, let's talk about the house." She had no idea what I already knew, or what I was already holding, or that I'd rearranged a good chunk of my adult life specifically so that when this exact phone call came, I'd be the one on the good end of it. She thought she was calling her failed son for a favor. I'll tell you what I'm holding, and what I said in that room, in the next part. I want to get the order right because the order is the whole thing. Update 1. So a lot of you wanted to know what I was holding before I got to the meeting, and I'm going to tell you, but I need you to sit with how ordinary it looked from the outside, because that's the part I like. When my parents took that private second loan against the house 3 years ago, they borrowed from a lender through a broker Anton knew socially, a guy who does short-term real estate paper, the kind of loans that fill the gap when a bank says no. Ugly rate, 2-year balloon, meaning at the end of the term the whole remaining chunk comes due in one payment and you're expected to have refinanced out of it by then. My parents were sure they would. Anton's work was going to bounce back. Micah's situation was going to stabilize. Everything was temporary. It always is, with them. Here's the thing about that kind of private paper. It gets sold. Lenders package these notes and move them, sometimes more than once, and the borrower usually doesn't even notice because the payment address just changes on the statement. Over the last couple of years, I'd been putting money into exactly this world. Small private notes, the boring secured lending side of real estate, because it turns out the renovation project has a real head for the part of the business nobody finds glamorous. And roughly a year ago, through the same small circle of brokers Anton had used, that note came up for sale. The original lender wanted out. The borrowers, my parents, had already been late twice and were clearly not refinancing on schedule. I bought it, quietly, through the entity I do this stuff under, which does not have my name splashed across it. It wasn't cheap, and it wasn't a trick. I paid what the note was worth to a lender who was happy to be rid of a shaky borrower. But the second that transfer closed, the person my parents owed that balloon payment to, the person who controls the terms and the payoff and what happens when the term ends, was me. Their renovation project, the one who cleaned the rust-stained toilet. They didn't know. The statements went to a servicing address, the way they always had. My mother made her family helps family phone call to me, having no idea she was calling the man who already held the most dangerous piece of paper in her life. I sat on that for weeks after her call, letting her think I was mulling over whether to chip in a few $1,000s like a good son. I wanted the meeting. I wanted all three of them in a room. They picked the house, of course. Where else? My mother made a whole production of it. She cooked. She set out the good stuff. She was doing the warm family thing so hard it was almost sad. Anton shook my hand like we were closing a deal, which, funny enough. Micah showed up late, which is the most Micah thing there is, and he walked in with this look like he was doing me a favor by gracing the project with his presence. First words out of him were basically that he hoped I wasn't going to make this weird, that Mom and Dad needed help, and this wasn't the time for me to have one of my things about the past. That's my brother, 30 years old, propped up his whole life, and his opening move is to preemptively frame me as the difficult one before anyone's even said what the meeting's about. I want to be honest that a part of me had waited a long time to watch him do that in a room where I already knew how it ended. We sat down, and my mother started the ask. It was gentle at first. They were behind on some things. The house had a loan coming due they hadn't quite gotten ahead of. They were exploring options, and they thought maybe as a family we could figure something out. Maybe I could help with a payment or two to buy some breathing room. Anton took over and got more specific, which is where it got interesting, because Anton actually laid out the whole situation not realizing he was explaining my own investment back to me. The balloon on the second loan was coming due in a few months. They couldn't refinance it. Anton's credit had taken hits. The house didn't appraise where they needed it to, and no bank would touch the payoff amount at their income. They were stuck owing a large single payment to a private note holder they'd never met, and if they couldn't pay it or refinance, that note holder could start the process of forcing a sale of the house to get paid. My father said the note holder's name, the entity name, out loud, at his own dining table, as the thing he was afraid of, and I let him. I let him sit in that fear and describe it to me and ask his failed son for help escaping it. Then I asked questions. Real ones. Calm ones. The kind that made Anton relax because it sounded like I was engaged. Like the project was finally being useful. How much was the balloon? What had they already tried? Had they talked to the note holder directly? What would they do if the payment came due and they couldn't make it? And with each answer, I understood exactly how deep they were. And I understood something else too, which is that Micah was in this further than my parents were letting on. Because here's a new piece I didn't have clean until that table. A chunk of what my parents borrowed against the house hadn't gone to their own bills at all. It had gone to Micah. Some of it into that lease he couldn't afford. Some of it into another one of his ventures. The guy is 30 and still getting something off the ground. And my parents had quietly mortgaged their own security to keep my brother afloat again. The same way they'd been doing since we were kids. Except this time, they'd used the house to do it. The very house I lived under for 7 years. They'd risked the roof to prop up the golden child. And now the bill was coming and they were asking the kid they'd stuck in the basement to cover it. I asked Micah directly what happened to the money, and this is where the room turned, because Micah got defensive fast. He said it wasn't like that Mom and Dad had offered, that he was going to pay them back once his thing landed, that I always did this. Made everything about me being wronged when other people were just living their lives. My mother jumped in to smooth it, saying nobody was blaming anybody, that families support each other, that Micah had been going through a lot. Anton said the money was between him and Micah and wasn't the point. And I said calmly that it was very much the point, because they were sitting here asking me to help save a house they'd remortgaged to fund my brother. And they hadn't thought to mention that part until I asked. My mother did the thing she does, which is to reframe me as the problem for bringing it up. She said this was exactly why things were hard with me, that I couldn't just help without turning it into a courtroom, that Micah never made them feel this way. And there it was. Micah never made them feel this way. The sentence I grew up inside of, said out loud again at 30, over the exact house they'd gambled on him. I didn't blow up. I've had years to plan how I'd handle this specific moment, and blowing up was never the plan. I just told them I understood the situation now, that I could see how serious it was, and that I wanted to look at everything properly before I committed to anything. Could they get me the loan documents, the payoff figure, the whole file, so I could see what I'd actually be helping with? And my father, relieved, grateful, said of course that he'd pull all of it together, that he knew I was good with this kind of thing. He was going to hand me the complete file on the note, my note. He was going to walk me through the terms of the loan I already owned, so that his disappointment of a son could understand what he was getting into. I told him that would be really helpful. There's a lot more to this, and it got more complicated fast because 2 things happened after that dinner that I did not fully see coming. One involving Micah's wife, who I haven't even gotten to yet, and who has her own very specific reasons for caring how this plays out, and one involving what my parents decided to do when they got impatient waiting for my answer. I'll get into both next part. But I walked out of that house that night having sat at their table, eaten my mother's food, watched them call me the problem one more time, and left holding everything. More soon. I know how this looks, and I know some of you are going to tell me to just walk away. I'm not walking away. I waited 7 years in a basement for this. I'm going to see it all the way through, and I'm going to do it without ever raising my voice. Update 2. Okay? So a bunch of you in the last thread guessed that my dad handing me the loan file was going to be the good part. It was better than that, but not for the reason you think. And I need to walk you through the week that followed because 3 separate things came loose at once, and I want to get the order right. Anton got me the file about 10 days after the dinner. He didn't just email it. He wanted to sit with me and go through it. Because in his head he was mentoring the project, finally finding something his disappointing son could be useful for. So we sat at the same table, and he walked me page by page through my own note. He explained the balloon amount to me. He explained the maturity date to me. He explained with real worry what this faceless note holder could do to them if they couldn't pay. And he asked me whether I thought there was any way to negotiate with a person like that, whether people like that were reasonable, whether they'd take partial payments. I told him people like that usually want their money and don't much care about the story behind it. He nodded like I'd given him something wise. I want to be clear that I felt fine doing this. Some of you keep waiting for the part where I feel bad. I sat there for 7 years while these people called me a renovation project at parties, and now my father was earnestly asking me to help him understand how to survive a debt he didn't know I owned. I was not conflicted. I was patient. But going through that file gave me the first new complication, and it's a big one. Buried in the payment history was something Anton skated past, and I made him go back to. There was a payment about 8 months ago, a large one, that had come from Micah. Not from my parents. Micah had made a payment on the note, which meant Micah knew about this loan in detail, knew the house was mortgaged to keep him afloat, knew the balloon was coming, and had been quietly kicking money at it to keep it from blowing up before he was ready for it to. So when Micah sat at that dinner acting like he was reluctantly showing up to help mom and dad through a rough patch, he already knew the house was underwater because of him, and he'd been managing the problem in secret. He wasn't a bystander to this. He was in the engine room. That reframed everything because it meant Micah's whole performance. The eye roll, the "don't make this weird," the "you always make it about yourself," was a guy protecting himself, not a golden child annoyed by his bitter brother. He needed this to stay a quiet family favor. He could not afford for anyone to actually open the books, because the book said the house got risked for him and he'd been papering over it. The second thing that came loose was Katie, Micah's wife. I've mentioned her, but I need to actually bring her in properly because she matters now and she's got her own reasons that have nothing to do with me. Katie married into this family 5 years ago, and here's what nobody says out loud at the parties. Katie's name is on things. When she and Micah set up their household, some of the accounts and at least one of the leases got put in both their names, because that's what married people do, and because Micah's own credit was already shaky enough that having Katie attached made everything easier to get approved. Katie, in other words, is legally tangled into Micah's finances in a way she's only recently started to understand the size of. She called me, and before anyone flags it, this wasn't some out-of-nowhere plot phone call. She called me because I'm the one person in this family who understood the paperwork and who wasn't invested in keeping her calm. She'd figured out from her own side that the house situation was worse than Micah had told her, and she'd started asking him questions he didn't want to answer, and she wanted to know from me, plainly, how bad it was. Not because she's on my side. Let me kill that idea now. Katie is on Katie's side, which is exactly correct, and which is 100 times more useful to me than an ally would be. We talked for a long time, and it was not a warm conversation because Katie doesn't like me much. I'm the weird basement brother-in-law she's heard framed as the family problem for 5 years. But she's not stupid, and she was scared, and she laid it out. She'd been finding out how much of their married life was propped on money that traced back to Micah's parents. And now the source of that money, the house, was in trouble, and she was starting to realize that if it all came down, her name was on enough of it that she'd go down attached to him. She asked me if the note holder could really force a sale. I told her the truth, which is yes, and that when that happens, the people who get hurt worst are usually the ones who signed things thinking they were just being supportive. I watched that land. I didn't tell her I was the note holder. It wasn't time. Here's why letting Katie stew was the move and not a betrayal of anybody. Katie asking hard questions inside that marriage put pressure on Micah from a direction he couldn't manage or spin. My parents he could handle. He'd handled them his whole life. He's their favorite. They'd forgive him anything. Me he could dismiss as bitter. But his own wife looking at him across their kitchen and asking why the house that keeps them afloat is about to be sold out from under everyone, and why he never told her how deep it went, that he could not charm his way out of. I didn't have to do anything to Katie. I just had to not lie to her when she asked, and let her go home to my brother with the real numbers in her head. And the third thing, this is the one that actually escalated it past the point of no return, is what my parents did when they got impatient waiting for my answer. Because remember, from their point of view, they'd asked their son for help. He'd said, "Let me look at everything." And then weeks were going by while the maturity date crept closer. My mother started calling. First, it was the warm check-ins. Then it got sharper. She started in on the guilt. After everything they'd done for me, the roof they put over my head all those years, and now their family was in trouble and I was dragging my feet, making them wait. Was I enjoying this? Was this my revenge for whatever I thought they did to me? That's a direct quote of the energy. The roof they put over my head, the basement, the rust-stained toilet, that roof. But here's the part that actually changed the board. When I still didn't jump, my parents decided to stop waiting on me and go find their own solution. And the solution they landed on was to lean harder on Micah and Katie to refinance the whole thing into Micah and Katie's names. The logic being that if Micah and Katie took on the house debt, the balloon problem would move off my parents and onto the young couple who have their whole earning years ahead of them. They pitched it as saving the family home. keeping it in the family, everyone pulling together. What it actually was my parents trying to shove the consequence of their favoritism onto the one person in the family who had no idea how deep it went until a week ago, Katie. And Katie found out they were doing this, that her in-laws were quietly maneuvering to put a failing debt on her name to save themselves. And that is the moment the family actually cracked, well before I did a single thing with the note. Because Katie went to Micah, and it turned into the fight that had been coming for 5 years, about the money, about the parents, about how Micah had let his family use their marriage as a financial cushion and never told her, about how she was not going to sign her name to a sinking house so his parents could keep their credit clean. And Micah, cornered, defended his parents over his wife because that's the pattern he's never once broken. The family always closes ranks around itself and around him, and it went badly. So take stock of where this is because it's a lot of pressure points at once and none of them are things I manufactured. My parents owe a balloon payment in a matter of weeks to a note holder who is secretly me. Micah's been hiding how deep his own hand is in it. Katie's realizing her name could go down with the ship and has stopped trusting any of them. My parents are actively trying to slide the debt onto Katie to save themselves. And Micah's marriage is coming apart over the exact favoritism that built this whole thing. The golden child finally being expensive instead of golden. I hadn't called the note yet. I hadn't even told them I owned it. All I'd done was decline to rescue them fast, ask honest questions, and tell one scared person the truth. And it was already spiraling because a family that spent 30 years propping up one son on borrowed money was always going to hit this. And I just made sure I was standing where I'd have the say when it did. Next part is the meeting where I tell them who holds the note. I've thought about that room for 7 years. I'll tell you exactly how it went and what I offered them, because I did offer them something. It just wasn't what they wanted, and it came with my name on it in a way they were never going to be able to laugh off at a party again. Last one coming. I'm not walking away. You know that by now. Final update. All right. This is the last one, and it's the part I've been carrying around for 7 years. So let me tell it right. By the time we got to the final meeting, the maturity date on the balloon was close. Weeks, not months. My parents had run out of runway. Their plan to slide the debt onto Katie had collapsed because Katie flatly refused to sign anything and told Micah that if he tried to pressure her into it, she was done. And she meant it in the way people mean things when they've stopped being scared and started being angry. So the family closed ranks the only way it knew how and came back to me because I was the one who'd said, "Let me look at everything." And in their minds, I was still deciding whether to be a good son. My mother set up the meeting the same way she sets up everything. At the house, food out, the whole performance. All 3 of them this time. Anton, Christina, Micah. Katie didn't come. She told me later she didn't want to be in a room where the family did its family thing, and I don't blame her. They started with the ask, sharper now because they were out of time. Anton laid out that the balloon was days away from due, that they'd exhausted every refinance option, that if the note holder called it, they'd lose the house, and that he needed to know right now whether I was going to help or not. My mother added the guilt she always adds. Everything they'd sacrificed for this family, the home they'd given all of us growing up, and how she never thought she'd see the day one of her sons would sit on his hands while his parents lost their house. And Micah, cornered and scared and still not able to help himself, went to the old move. He said the thing about how typical it was, that I was clearly enjoying this, that I'd always been like this, always keeping score, always the victim. And that maybe if I'd spent less time feeling sorry for myself in that basement, and more time being part of this family, I wouldn't be so eager to watch it burn. That's the sentence I'd been waiting on. The basement, thrown at me one more time, as an insult, by the brother it was built to elevate. So I told them. I didn't do it dramatically. I've imagined doing it dramatically 1,000 times, and when the moment came, I just said it plainly, because plain was heavier. I told them I'd already looked at everything, months ago, more closely than they had, because I was the note holder. The entity that held the paper on their house, the faceless investor Anton had been so afraid of, the one he'd sat at this table and asked me how to negotiate with, that was me. I'd bought their note a year ago. I owned the debt. The balloon they were terrified of, the one coming due in days, was owed to me. Nobody said anything for a second. Then it came apart the way I knew it would, all 3 of them at once. My mother said it wasn't possible, that I couldn't have. How could I do this to my own family? Anton went quiet and started asking the real questions. When? How much? Through who? Because Anton, whatever else he is, understood immediately that the ground had moved, and there was no arguing with the paper. And Micah got loud. Micah said I'd planned this, that this was sick, that I'd been lying to their faces for months, that what kind of person buys their own parents' debt in secret and sits on it. And I let him finish. And then I said the thing I'd actually come to say, which is that They'd had it backwards for 30 years. I told them I didn't buy the note to trick anyone. I bought it because when your family spends your whole childhood telling you you're the disappointment and then mortgages the house you grew up in to keep your brother afloat, and then calls you for money, you stop hoping they'll change and you make sure that when the reckoning comes, you're the one holding it. I told them the basement wasn't the low point of my life. The basement was where I did the math. I told them I lived rent-free in the place they meant as a punishment, and I turned it into the down payment on being the person who now decided what happened to their house. Then, I gave them the terms. Because I did come with terms. This isn't a story where I just gloat and leave. Here's what I offered. And I want you to notice it's not a scheme. It's just leverage used the way they use theirs. I told them I would not forgive the debt, not a dollar of it. But I would not force a sale either. Because a forced sale is messy and I didn't need the mess. Instead, I would take the house at payoff. I'd clear the balloon by taking title. They would deed the house to me, the debt would be satisfied, and they would not be thrown out onto the street with nothing. They could stay, as tenants, paying me rent at market rate on the house they'd owned with a lease I controlled and terms I set, the same way they'd controlled the terms of my life for 7 years. The house that had my rust-stained basement bathroom in it would be mine, and they would live in it by my permission, and every month they'd be reminded exactly who the renovation project turned out to be. My mother said she would never. She said she'd rather lose it to a stranger than take charity from a son who'd betrayed them. And I told her, calmly, that it wasn't charity and it wasn't a stranger's problem anymore. It was mine, and that she could take the lease or she could take the forced sale. But either way, the ownership was leaving her hands, and the only question on the table was whether she wanted to keep a roof over her head or keep her pride. I told her I'd learned from the best that those two things don't always come together. A family taught me that, at a lot of parties. Anton took the deal. Not that night, but within the week. Because Anton is the one who understands numbers, and he understood there was no version where they kept the house, and taking my terms meant they stayed housed. My mother didn't speak to me through any of the signing. Fine. I didn't need her to. Now, the cascade, because it didn't stop with the house, and this is the part that actually finished it. Micah's marriage did not survive. Katie had watched him defend his parents over her one too many times, and the house blowing up was the end of a thing that had been ending for a year. She's separating from him. And because her name was tangled into so much of their joint finances, she came to me, not as a friend. We're still not that, but as the one person who understood the paperwork and who had no loyalty to Micah, to help her understand how to pull herself clean of the debts her marriage had buried her in. I helped her, not for her. Because every hour I spent helping Katie get free was an hour Micah spent watching his wife choose his basement brother's competence over his family's chaos. The golden child, for the first time in his life, was the one nobody was propping up. And Micah himself, the thing that got him wasn't me. It was that the money finally ran out. For 30 years, the family's whole economy ran on quietly moving resources toward Micah. And the house was the last reservoir. And now the house was mine and the reservoir was dry. Nobody's floating his next venture. Nobody's covering his lease. His parents can't because they're paying me rent and I won't, obviously. For the first time in his life, my brother has to stand on exactly what he built himself, which is nothing, because he never had to. That's not revenge I did to him. That's just the bill for 30 years, and I'm the one who stopped paying it forward. People keep asking if I feel good. Here's the honest answer, and it's not the clean one Reddit wants. I don't feel healed. I'm not at peace with any of them, and I'm not going to pretend 7 years in a basement turned into a life lesson I'm grateful for. What I feel is even. For the first time since I was 17, the ledger is balanced, and I'm the one holding the pen. My parents live in the house on my terms. My mother still won't speak to me, and I've made my peace with never fixing that, because I don't want to fix it. Micah is 30, and finally, permanently, the family's actual problem instead of me. They spent years calling me the renovation project. Stripped to the studs, no permit, never going to turn out. Well, I own the building now, and every one of them lives in it knowing exactly who did the renovating and exactly who's holding the note. That's the whole thing. Thanks for reading it. I'm not walking away, and I never did.